As you think about the budget, and you heard a lot today about the budget, and Jair, you want to tell me what you learned today? It's complex.
It's all the state's fault, right?
It's all the state's fault. And you just heard, talking about the state of Florida hasn't seen such a budget revenue surplus in 15 years. How's that impact your budget? Not one dime. You're going to get more unfunded mandates handed down to you probably this session, and you're going to have to figure out how to do with it. Who's responsible in your county for putting together your budget?
County administrator.
County administrator, and it depends upon how large of a county you are, how small of a county, so there's some variances to it, but who's responsible for passing the budget? County Commission. County Commissioner is held responsible for the budget. What's the problem with that? Do you guys control everybody you got to fund? No. Who's the big dog in the room when it comes to county budgets? Yeah, you guys all know that, right? Statewide, about how much of the budget does the sheriff get out of a county budget? Any thoughts? What percentage? 45? 60. Yeah, it's actually about 60% of your budget. And some counties, it's actually higher than that. And we just heard, this thought by a legislator that we can go to funding county revenue all by sales tax. Well, what's sales tax bring? What's 1 cent bring in Miami-Dade? Anybody know? It's about $500 million. What's it bring in Lafayette County? About $337,000, And so when you really start looking at the government and what you're facing, there's 67 counties that all have very different budget requirements. You get different pots of money. How many of you have what's called the local option sales tax? Okay? In Escambia County, we have a local option sales tax. It is great. I get about $34 million a year out of local option sales tax. My neighbors in Santa Rosa County, I can build roads and new jails and all this different stuff. And Santa Rosa County is trying to build a new courthouse, right? Or is it Okaloosa? It's Santa Rosa. It's Santa Rosa. So they tried to pass local option sales tax this year. Ours passed through at a 67% rate. And Santa Rosa's got defeated, right? 45-55. So, you'll hear these different tools today that Ginger Delegal did an excellent presentation and said, these are the different options that you can use, but the problem is every county is different. What works in one county doesn't necessarily work in another. So as you look at that, another problem is you're sitting there thinking, I want to use this tax money to do this project. What's the problem with that? Sometimes it's already committed. In Taylor County, the local option sales tax is committed to the local hospital through at least 2030. So they don't have that option on the table. What's the amount of sales tax you can go up to right now within a county? Anybody know? 8.5%. So you look at these different options you have, and you still have a cap on how much money you can spend. You might remember Ginger was talking about those different waivers that the state has put out that impact taxes, veterans waiver, which I love. I'm a veteran, I appreciate that, and the elderly, which I appreciate now. And, you have all these different waivers to bring down the amount of taxes that you as a county collect. How about the school board? Do those waivers impact the school board? No, they don't. And you're probably amazed, how many of you have been in office only since November? How long did it take you from going from being the savior of your county to now you've drank the Kool-Aid and you're one of those guys? What do you mean you can't do that for me, Russell? Golly, that's not why I elected you. And you find out county government is very, very complicated. I wish that every state legislator had to be a county commissioner before they go to Tallahassee and sit there and talk about how much money counties have. Because frankly, they could learn a lot about how to fund local government if they had to live it a little bit, kind of like the Sunshine Law. So when we look at budgeting and how you're going to create that balance, you don't have a lot of control over constitutional officers. In Taylor County, we had the mayor, a former mayor became a county commissioner. When I sat down to start bringing her up to speed, she says, "What do you mean we don't control the constitutional officer's budget? I want to hold the sheriff to this amount. Can't do that. We can take it to the governor." Okay? What's the only constitutional officer that you have control over their budget? Actually, it's the supervisor of elections, the only constitutional officer that you as a county commission actually have control over, unless you're a chartered county. So, the budget tends to be, if you're not careful, it can really be a win-lose type proposition. And you don't want to make it a win-lose proposition with your peers if you can help it. Why not? Huh?
Everybody loses.
Everybody loses? You got to have 3 votes to get anything done as a county commissioner, right? You can't do it on one. So you got to make sure that as you transition out of the election mode. And you got to realize that those guys and gals that are sitting on that dais with you are probably better people than you thought they were or you were told they were, because you guys been in office 6, 8, 9 months. You're probably already the devil incarnate. And what you learn is everything that's written about you in the newspaper is not really true. And since we have the Sunshine Law, when you try to work with your peers, try to understand that the reason you think they're doing something might not be the reason they're really doing it. Give them the benefit of the doubt, because when you're sitting there, you're going to learn with your experience that a lot of times people are going to accuse you of doing things that you would never, ever do in your life, but they don't have all the facts, and so they're assuming you did something wrong. Try to give your peers the benefit of the doubt. It's the same thing with the constitutional officers. When you're working with the constitutional officers, you want to treat them with dignity and respect. Don't say, "We want the sheriff to come up to us and explain his budget." What's a better approach? Go see him as an individual commissioner. Sit down with him or her. Tell me what your needs are. How can I help you? Because if you sit there at the dais and you try to use the bully pulpit with your constitutional officers, you're going to create issues of win-lose. Let's hold our questions till the end, okay? Because the mind cannot take in more than the seat can endure. In dealing with our policy, why do we have policies? Any thoughts? Why do we create budgeting policies? Okay, they give us guidelines. Okay, they give us a way to do things. I know that I've seen several times a new county commissioner is elected, and they come in and say, "We're going to have to cut the budget." Now, all the old people, all the old commissioners sitting there thinking, "We have to cut the budget almost every year." And then another statement you'll hear is, "We're going to do a line item veto." Duh. Don't assume that your peers aren't already doing a good job on the budgeting just because of what you've heard. What's the difference? What's the role of the administrator versus the board in putting together that budget? Any thoughts?
Shouldn't the administrator be a support function of the board?
Okay, the administrator should be a support function. Yes.
The department heads to create a budget and then gives us options.
Yes, the administrator should lay out options for you, and the administrator's responsible for the day-to-day operations. And having been on both sides of the dais, I can tell you, I personally enjoy being the administrator because I can talk to all 5 county commissioners and figure out what they want to have done. Where as a county commissioner, you can't have those discussions at the same level. But the administrator should be working for you. What do you need to provide the administrator going into your budget?
Guidance, policy.
Guidance. Okay, this is really what we want to do. This is what I'd like to see you to do. You know, these are my priorities going into the budget year. How can you make that? Now, one of the things that the administrator a lot of times is going to do, he's going to turn around and say, those funds are already allocated. This is what they're allocated to. And what he's got to do and what you've got to understand is the administrator works for who? 3 out of 5 of you. Okay? And I tell my board members on a regular basis, and Commissioner Moody used to be one of my commissioners, he'll tell you, I say, I work for 3 out of 5 of you, and I really don't care which 3 out of 5 it is. You know, because when y'all vote, that's it. But a lot of times you've got pet projects that you want to get done that conflict with other pet projects that other county commissioners want to have done. And you got to understand it's not fair to try to put the county administrator in that position to where they're working all those issues, you know, while it hurts other board members, you know. So a good county administrator is going to try to figure out how to work through those issues, but at the same time, a lot of times they're going to have to lay it out before the board. You're going to have a vote on it. So what about your relationship with city government? How tough is that, and why does that become an issue? Do you have to get along with your cities? Yeah, you do. And we have a saying in Escambia County, sometimes they think we're the bank of Escambia County because they want us to forgive debts or continue to do more and more and more. So you're going to have to continue to work through that with not only the city, but also other stakeholders within the community. You are responsible as a steward to try to figure out how to balance that budget along with your county commissioners, other county commissioners. And policies are normally put together at a time that you're able to sit down and think through issues without being on fire. So that when you do get put on fire, when somebody's putting a lot of pressure on you, you can think about it. One of the things that is a good tool is we had an ordinance in place that says you cannot come back before the Board of County Commissioners to ask for additional funding during the budget year unless you have 2 public hearings and it serves an overwhelming public need. Okay? What that does is that keeps you from being inundated as a board by having people come to you time after time after time requesting funding for you during the middle of the budget year. The other thing you want to do is make sure that it has to be looked at in light of your overall budget. So that's a tool that can help you as you have very controversial things that come up before a board or very impassioned pleas to you. We had and the reason we put that into place, we had a veterans group come in and wanted a huge veterans monument put in, very political, and I must say I was a county commissioner at the time, and I caved in because the seats were packed, you know, and I made a bad decision, so I said, we need, you know, I'm going to sit down and write a policy to where that doesn't happen. So as a county commissioner, what's your number one job? Besides being the budget, what are you?
Punching bag?
Well, you're a punching bag, yeah. You are a legislator. Okay, you're a legislator. You write legislation. And so if you don't like the way that the county is being ran through policy and procedures, what can you do? You change the legislation. You write new legislation. Okay, you get with staff, and staff can help you craft that legislation. Or you have peers like through the Florida Association of Counties that you can pick up the phone and say, hey, what do you guys do in Manatee County, how do you handle this situation? And I can tell you, having been around for a few years, that Florida Association of Counties, one of the most valuable things you get out of it is the people that you meet that you can pick up the phone and say, Jair, how do you guys do this? And then Jair can say, man, I don't know. We just, or he can lay that out for you. So as you go through those, you want to make sure that you're working through it. A good thing to do is get together as a board before you start going through it to lay out some budget guidance for your administrator as to what areas you want to have funded, okay? If you think there's specific social programs you want to start or something, have the board work through that to where you're giving clear guidance as a board rather than the administrator and the budget officer are just sitting there listening to 5 individual voices. Level of service. What do we mean when we talk about level of service? Okay. Level of service determines where you're going to put your money and how much money you're going to pay. Like we have some commissioners that feel like we should pick up the trash off of the road, weekly. What's the problem with that? Cost money, fuel, resources. So you need to have those discussions with your county administrator and say, if we want to do this, what's the cost and what is the opportunity cost that's lost? If you're going to have the road department doing X, what does that prevent them from doing? Investment policy, you need to look at that. Know the specifics of your county. You need to know what your county demographics are. What the voters want might be very different than what you think they want. All right? Know what a mill brings in for you. There's a big difference between being capped at 10 mills when a mill brings in $500 million versus $333,000. When you look at motor fuel tax, this morning Ginger was talking about motor fuel tax. The problem, I know, like in Taylor, when we looked at motor fuel tax, unless you go up on the motor fuel tax, you're going to continue every year to lose money and not be able to maintain your road. So, anybody want to raise fees or taxes? No. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look at it and say, if this is really what the public wants, then you're going to have to make those hard choices about how are we going to fund it. And I can tell you, I know just about all the county administrators in the state, and not very many of them have rabbits in their hats. So they've got a set of tools that they can work with, but you as a board really owe it to that administrator to say, these are our priorities. If road paving is a priority and you want to pave more roads, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to try to get grants. You're going to have to work with Department of Transportation. But eventually, you're going to have to increase motor fuel tax. When you look at the state of Florida was a lot smarter in their motor fuel tax than they were with the counties. I should say they treated themselves better than they treated us. Ours is just a straight 4 cents, 5 cents, 6 cents. Theirs actually has an inflation clause on it. Okay, it goes up with the CPI. So once you get to that amount of money, then you're going to have to figure out how are you going to pave, what are you going to pave. You want to put policies in place. When you talk about road paving, if you have a criteria for what type of roads get paved, and then you can show them, and then you can show them what your funding is, it helps you a lot as a county commissioner to where you're not sitting there saying, that's the number one road on my road paving list, but I don't know when it's ever going to get paved. If you can get your guys to help project that out. And the other thing is if you really need to increase taxes, you can go back and say, look, to be honest with you, your road's not going to get paved because we're at 8 cents a gallon, and unless we go up, it's never going to get paved. And then if they know that, they're a lot more likely to come back and support raising the motor fuel tax. If they don't know that, and you don't really educate yourself to that, you'll never make that connection, and then both you and the public are just going to continue to be frustrated. It's always the trade-off of taxes and services. Okay? The things that really will make you have a hard time in your budgeting process is when you start drawing lines in the sand and when you start having big arguments. So, you know, while you want to be out of a mode of still campaigning for your seat, you do want to make sure that you understand that your relationships with those constitutional officers and your other commissioners are critical in your success and be able to get the things out of the budget that you need. Now, when we look at silos, one of the things that you find in a lot of times is you'll look at your reserves and stuff and you'll say, well, we got all this money in reserve. Well, yeah, you might have a lot of money in reserve, but it might be a restricted fund, which means you can't spend that money on what you want to. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask a quick question? On enterprise funds, I've heard that you can use enterprise funds for other things, not just like, say, for the airport. Once those have been met, that you can spend it on roads or other things. Is that true? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, it really depends upon the enterprise fund, but if it's a airport enterprise fund, that's usually highly unlikely because most of those funds have a string on them from the FAA. It really depends upon the enacting legislation. If you have an ordinance or something that governs.
How would I learn that? Where would I go to find that information?
Your budget officer.
Okay.
Okay. State unfunded mandates. Your best defense against state unfunded mandates, it's being involved in the Florida Association of Counties. It is your best lobby tool. And what happens is when these mandates come through, a lot of times the legislator that is trying to enact the statute changes doesn't understand what the impact is to your county. And so right now there's an issue, several issues. Medicaid is really a big issue that's going to have a budgetary impact. But another impact that we're looking at right now is the location tax, okay, for right-of-ways use. And if you look at that, what it basically says right now is if a utility wants to relocate, if they have to locate because you're doing construction and you've allowed them to locate that utility, then you're going to have to pay to relocate that utility if it's on your right-of-way, like if it's on a county right-of-way in a neighborhood. And they also do not have to provide you the plans. So then you're going to have to relocate the lines, you're going to have to pay for the relocation stuff, and so FAC is looking into that. But when you're putting together your budgets, you've got to look at how has the legislation changed? Are there additional hidden costs out there that we need to have reserve funds set up for? Okay, budgeting revenues, just like any balance sheet, set down, figure out what your revenues are, what your expenses are, and then where can you increase those revenues. If you look at Ginger's document from earlier this morning, she lays out for you most of the, actually all the tax revenue sources that you have. Now, the problem is when you start enacting MSBUs and stuff, that's usually about an 18-month process to enact a new MSBU. So if you don't do it, if you want to start it now, you're probably not going to get it done for a good 18 months. So make sure you're working with your administrator and your finance office and your board to get those things taken care of. Don't estimate, okay? Make sure that you have healthy reserves. There are some counties cut it pretty close, and hasn't happened in several years, but I'm told that about 20 years ago there was a small county that had a hard time making payroll. So if you look at your budget officer, one of the things you're going to find is going to create questions for you is a lot of times you'll see reserves in all these different funds. And that's really what you want to do is make sure that you do have a healthy reserve. Now, what is a healthy reserve?
5%.
Okay, 5%, 6%, 10%. And I mean, you know, as you look at it, all of those are healthy reserves. Now, one of the things I will caution you about reserves is if you have too big of a reserve, what's that going to do to your bottom line on your budget? You're probably going to have, you know, if you have too big a reserve and you're not careful, it might appear that you need to increase your millage. And, you know, so you might be able to lower your reserve, but you want to make sure that you're doing it responsibly. Okay? Ad valorem taxes, and a lot of the smaller counties, just about all the ad valorem taxes go to fund the constitutional officers, including the sheriff. And so it leaves very little room for you. Balance in the general fund. Theory, run it like a business. What's the problem with running county government like a business? Okay, restrictions, okay. What else?
We don't make widgets and other things like an entrepreneur can.
No public purpose to business and there's profit to business.
Yeah, public concerns. Would we do a lot of the things we do in a business that we have to do in a county? No way. You know? We look at that and we say, well, that service doesn't generate any revenue, cut it. You know? Try that in county government and, you know, we'll see where you're at. But, you know, so you're going to have to balance that out. And a lot of times, if you got a really good question, you say, this is a blinding flash of the obvious, why aren't we doing it? What I would tell you before you talk about it from the dais is do your homework and see if it's ever been talked about before, because a lot of times you'll find out there's a very good reason that you don't do it. And if you're not careful, you talk about it from the dais, and what happens? Newspaper headlines, television cameras, and the next thing you know, you're sitting there with egg on your face, okay? Like I say, winners and losers, it tends to be a political process, so try to depoliticize what's going on. Lack of transparency, okay? Remember, even when you're talking about the budget at your budget meetings, the public perception is always going to be what? You're doing things behind closed doors, there's not any transparency and stuff. So try to talk to people, talk to your Rotary clubs and other, you know, Optimus, Kiwanis, whatever clubs. Try to make sure you get the word out, make sure you're having public hearings. Besides, just those are needed. Anytime we pass a new tax, the assumption is always going to be we don't need it, we already have too much, right? Watch out for micromanagement. You've got, you know, just like in a business, you don't want to micromanage your staff. What happens when you start micromanaging people? They're going to shut down. They're not going to do more than you tell them to do because they're afraid they're not going to do what you want them to do. So give good, broad guidelines. Don't live beyond your means. Okay? Understand, and I mean, I would believe that just about everybody in here is a fiscal conservative. Okay? But what happens is we all have our pet projects. You know, and you have to understand, a lot of times when you want something to get done, that you're going to have to look at it through the eyes of your peers and the public and say, is this for a select group or is this for the good of the community? And those are tough issues because people become very impassioned about their pet project. Planning for the worst case scenario. All right? What we need to think about is what happens if we have a hurricane? Do we have enough rainy day funds in case we have a hurricane that we haven't dipped so far in our budget that we can't survive it? What's going to be the impact if the communication surtax passes? And, and they say they're going to hold us whole, but if that changes at the last minute, like sometimes it can, what's going to happen to us? New recurring cost. If you get a grant, is that grant ever free? No, usually it's going to come with some type of recurring cost. If you get a grant for a park, you're going to have to maintain that park in perpetuity, forever. Okay, you're going to have cost, maintenance, staff going out there. So you've got to look at those type of things. Remember how you're always viewed. Before you were elected, you were, Terry, we need you there. We got to have you there. We know you're going to look out for us. But as soon as you vote contrary to a lot of what your constituents want because you know it's the right thing, remember their perception of you starts to change. As you look out the future, you've got to think about what's going to impact us. Your aging infrastructure. As you look at what are the things that you really need to make sure you're taking care of before you take on a new project to build a park. What about the current parks you got? You look at building new roads. What about the roads that you've already got in place? Are they properly maintained? The other thing, the baby boomer retirement. A lot of county governments have guys that were born during my time period that are, looking a few years down the road saying, hey, I can retire and what looks good. So are you growing a new staff? Are you bringing in young blood that can help make that transition? But the other large impact is a lot of you need to look at policies and procedures and what are your payouts like? The school board pays out a massive amount of dollars for sick leave. And Taylor, before what we did is we did a way to where you could accumulate as much sick leave as you needed, but we did not pay you out for it. Because sick leave is for being sick. And so when you're paying out $10,000 or $15,000 for somebody's sick leave, that's a nice little bank account, and that's a great benefit. But look at the things that you can tweak to make sure that we're being as responsible as we can. So what I would just say is make sure that you know your county demographics, you know what a mill will bring in for you, you know where you're at on your sales tax, you know where you're at on your motor fuel tax, you realize what that generates, what it will not generate as you talk with your administrators. So if you work together, budget cycle is not a problem, but if you start drawing lines in the sand, nobody wins. So with that, I think we're still over time, so I apologize to you. So any questions?